Right now, in thousands of backyard hives, the temperature inside is climbing past the point where wax starts to soften and comb starts to sag. And most beekeepers won't notice anything's wrong until they open the lid and find a collapsed mess of melted comb and dead brood. There's a fix for this that beekeepers were using 100 years ago. It takes about 10 minutes, and almost nobody does it anymore. If you want the kind of practical, no-nonsense beekeeping information that actually keeps your hive alive through the hardest parts of the season, hit subscribe, because that's exactly what this channel is built around, every single week. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what's happening inside an overheating hive, why modern hive designs quietly make this problem worse instead of better, and the simple ventilation fix old-time beekeepers relied on before anyone had ever heard of a screened bottom board. A fix you can put in place today in less time than it takes to read this description. Let's start with what's actually happening inside that box when the temperature climbs. Because this isn't just bees being uncomfortable, it's a genuine structural and biological crisis unfolding in real time. Beeswax begins to soften noticeably, starting around 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and it gets genuinely unstable well before it fully liquefies. A colony works hard to keep its brood nest at a tight, stable 93 to 95 degrees, regardless of outside conditions, using evaporative cooling, worker bees fanning at the entrance, spreading thin films of water across cells, and even bringing water back to the hive specifically for this purpose. But that cooling system has limits, and once ambient temperatures push into the upper 90s or triple digits for an extended stretch, especially inside a dark-colored box sitting in full sun, the internal temperature can climb high enough that comb loaded with honey, which is heavy and only held up by the wax structure itself, starts to sag, stretch, and in bad cases, collapse entirely under its own weight. Here's what almost nobody tells beginners about this collapse, and it's the part that turns an inconvenience into a genuine disaster. When a heavily loaded frame of comb sags and eventually tears loose, it doesn't fail quietly. Bees get trapped and crushed underneath falling comb, brood gets smothered, and the honey itself pours down through the hive, coating and drowning workers on lower frames, sometimes triggering a secondary crisis of robbing from neighboring colonies drawn in by the smell of exposed honey pooling at the bottom board. A single bad heat event, left unmanaged, can undo weeks of a colony's buildup in a single afternoon. Not every hive faces equal risk here, and knowing which colonies to watch most closely can save you from checking every box with the same level of urgency. A brand new package colony, still working entirely on fresh, thin, newly drawn wax that hasn't had a full season to firm up and thicken, is considerably more vulnerable to sagging than an established colony on comb that's been drawn and reinforced over a year or two of use. A colony that's heavy with a strong honey flow already capped and stored, exactly the successful, productive hive you'd otherwise be proud of, is simultaneously carrying the most weight on its comb, making it the most likely candidate for a collapse if heat softens that wax at the wrong moment. In a strange way, your best-performing hive in a good honey year is often your highest-risk hive when a heat wave hits, precisely because it has the most to lose structurally. You've probably seen the early warning sign without realizing what it actually means. Bearding, that thick curtain of bees clustered on the outside of the hive, hanging off the front and sometimes wrapping around the sides, looks dramatic, and a lot of beginners see it and panic, assuming it means the colony is swarming or under attack. It's neither. Bearding is a release valve. Those bees have left the interior specifically to reduce the population generating heat inside the box, and to free up airflow space for the bees still fanning and cooling within. Bearding on its own isn't an emergency. It's actually the colony successfully managing a heat crisis using the only tool it has. The real danger isn't the bearding itself, it's what's happening on the frames those bees left behind, where the fanning workers still inside are fighting a losing battle against a design flaw nobody installed on purpose. There's a piece of this cooling system that gets overlooked constantly, and it's arguably just as important as airflow itself: water. Evaporative cooling only works if there's actually water available to evaporate, and a colony without a reliable, close water source has to send foragers further afield to find one, which means fewer bees available for the cooling effort at exactly the moment the hive needs every worker it can spare. A single strong colony on a hot day can go through a genuinely surprising amount of water, hauled back drop by drop in individual bees' crops, specifically to spread across comb surfaces and fan into evaporation. If the nearest water source is a farm pond a quarter-mile away, instead of a shallow dish 20 feet from the hive, that's real energy and real time being spent on transport instead of cooling, and it shows up as a colony that seems to struggle with heat far more than a neighboring hive of similar strength that happens to sit near a creek or a deliberately placed water station. Something as simple as a shallow tray with rocks or marbles in it, filled daily, positioned near the hives, removes that entire bottleneck for a few dollars and 5 minutes of setup. Stick around, because coming up, I'm going to show you exactly why the modern hive box, the one almost every backyard beekeeper is using right now, is quietly working against the bees on the hottest days of the year, and the specific fix that undoes it in about 10 minutes. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the standard Langstroth-style box that most of us keep bees in wasn't actually designed with peak summer heat as the primary concern. It was designed for modularity, standardized frame spacing, and ease of honey extraction, which are all genuinely great things, but airflow was never the design priority. A solid bottom board, a tightly fitted inner cover, and a snug outer cover create a box that's excellent at retaining heat through a cold winter, and mediocre at releasing it during a heat wave, because there's often only one real point of airflow, the front entrance, for hot air to escape through, and hot air naturally wants to rise, not exit sideways out a low entrance near the bottom of the box. Painting hive boxes a dark color doesn't help either, and it's a mistake plenty of beginners make without realizing the consequence, usually because a dark stain or paint just looks appealing on a rustic-style hive. A dark painted box sitting in full afternoon sun can run measurably hotter internally than a white or light-colored box under identical conditions, simply from basic heat absorption. The same reason a black car interior gets brutally hot faster than a white one on a sunny day. Combine a dark box, a solid bottom board, a tightly sealed top, and full sun exposure with no afternoon shade, and you've built, entirely by accident, one of the most heat-retentive designs possible for a creature that needs to actively fight to keep its internal nest below 95 degrees. It's worth addressing the modern option that a lot of beekeepers reach for first, because it genuinely helps, and it's worth understanding how it fits alongside the old-timer trick rather than instead of it. A screened bottom board, a mesh floor replacing the solid wood bottom board, lets air flow up through the hive from underneath as well as out the top. And it doubles as a mite management tool, since a portion of dislodged mites fall straight through the screen instead of climbing back onto a bee. It's a genuinely good piece of equipment, typically running $20 to $35, and plenty of serious beekeepers run one on every hive as standard practice. But a screened bottom board alone doesn't solve the problem we've been describing, because it addresses airflow at the bottom of the box, while hot air is trying to escape from the top, where it naturally rises to. The two approaches are complementary, not competing. A screened bottom board improves airflow moving up through the hive, and a top vent gap gives that rising hot air somewhere to actually go once it gets there. Beekeepers running both together typically see the most noticeable temperature improvement. But if you're choosing one to start with because of cost or time, the top vent costs nothing and takes 10 minutes, while a quality screened bottom board is a real purchase and a bigger project to retrofit onto an existing hive. The style of outer cover you're running changes this math too, and it's another detail that traces straight back to old commercial practice. A telescoping cover, the boxy style with sides that wrap down over the top super, common on most beginner kits sold today, creates a genuinely tight seal, which is excellent for keeping rain and pests out, but does the colony no favors on a hot day, since that snug overlap leaves very little natural gap for air to slip out, even before you've propped anything up. A migratory cover, the flatter, simpler board style historically favored by commercial operators who needed hives to stack tightly on a truck bed, actually sits with a bit more natural give around the edges, and it was never designed with an airtight seal as a priority in the first place. If you're running telescoping covers, which most backyard beekeepers are, the propped shim trick matters even more, because you're actively working against a cover style that was built to seal tight rather than breathe. Here's a scenario that plays out constantly in backyard apiaries every summer, and it's worth sitting with because it shows how invisible this problem can be until it's too late. A beekeeper sets up a new hive in spring, picks a sunny spot in the yard, specifically because bees like sun, paints the box a handsome dark brown to match their fence, and doesn't think about airflow again until a July heat wave rolls through. They check the hive a week later, expecting to see healthy buildup, and instead find sagging, torn comb on the top two frames, a noticeable die-off of capped brood that never emerged, and a strange, faintly sour smell from spilled honey that's already started attracting robber bees from a neighboring colony. Nothing about their beekeeping technique was wrong in the traditional sense. They didn't skip an inspection or miss a mite count. The entire problem traces back to a box that simply couldn't shed heat fast enough in a spot with no relief from direct afternoon sun. There's a climate variable buried in all of this that changes how urgent this problem actually is depending on where you keep bees, and it's worth understanding rather than assuming the same rules apply everywhere. Evaporative cooling, the core mechanism bees rely on to bring internal temperature down, depends on humidity, the same way sweat cools a human body less effectively on a muggy day than a dry one. In a hot, dry climate, a colony fanning water across comb gets a lot of cooling benefit from each drop because the surrounding air is thirsty enough to pull that moisture away quickly. In a hot, humid climate, that same evaporative effort accomplishes noticeably less because the air is already saturated and reluctant to absorb more moisture, which means a colony in a humid region hits genuine heat stress at a lower actual temperature than an identical colony in a dry climate would. If you keep bees somewhere genuinely humid, much of the southeastern half of the country, for instance, that top vent gap and any shade you can add matter even more than the raw thermometer reading might suggest, because your bee's primary cooling tool is working with one hand tied behind its back before the heat even arrives. There's a practical reason to get ahead of this before the worst of summer arrives, beyond just protecting comb, and it connects to something a lot of viewers of this channel are already tracking closely. A number of mite treatments carry specific temperature restrictions for safe, effective application, and a colony already fighting genuine heat stress is a worse candidate for treatment timing in general. Stressed bees handle chemical or acid treatments less predictably than a colony that's cool, calm, and functioning normally. If a heat wave rolls through during exactly the window you'd planned to test and treat for mites, you're now managing two overlapping problems at once instead of one. And getting ventilation sorted out ahead of time means a heat wave doesn't force you to delay or rush a treatment decision that has its own separate, serious consequences if it's mistimed. So here's the fix, and it's genuinely almost embarrassingly simple once you see it, which is probably exactly why it fell out of common practice as commercial equipment and standardized instructions became the default way most new beekeepers learn. Old-time beekeepers, working with hives long before anyone manufactured a screened bottom board, solved this with a simple top ventilation trick, propping the outer cover up slightly at the back using a small shim, a flat stick, or even a couple of stones, creating a narrow gap between the outer cover and the inner cover. That small gap does something the front entrance alone can't do efficiently on its own. It gives rising hot air an actual exit point near the top of the hive, letting the colony's natural convection do a huge share of the cooling work without a single bee needing to fan continuously at the entrance instead of doing other work. Here's exactly how to do it, because the details matter, and getting them wrong can create new problems instead of solving the old one. Take a small piece of wood, even a thick popsicle stick or a short length of scrap lumber, about 3/8 of an inch thick works well, and place it under one back corner of the outer cover, so the cover tilts up slightly at the rear while still sitting flush and rain-resistant at the front. This creates a narrow gap at the back, protected from direct rain by the overhang of the cover itself, that lets hot air escape from up near the inner cover without turning into an open invitation for rain to pour straight down into the hive during a summer storm. The whole process, start to finish, takes about 10 minutes per hive, and it costs essentially nothing if you're using scrap wood you already have lying around. There's a small side benefit here, worth mentioning if you've been debating whether a hive needs another honey super yet. Beyond giving the bees more room to store a strong nectar flow, an added super also increases the total air volume inside the hive, giving hot air more space to rise into and dilute through before it ever needs to escape out that top vent gap. It's not a reason on its own to add a super before a colony is genuinely ready for one. An oversized, underpopulated hive brings its own problems. But if a colony is already sitting right at the edge of needing more room, a summer heat wave is one more small point in favor of not delaying that decision any further. There's a mistake worth flagging here, because a well-meaning beginner who hears more airflow is good can easily overcorrect and create a different problem entirely. Don't remove the entrance reducer entirely in the name of ventilation during a heat wave, especially on a newer or smaller colony, because a wide-open entrance combined with the smell of a stressed hive is exactly the kind of opportunity robber bees and wasps are looking for. The goal is targeted airflow at the top, where hot air naturally wants to go anyway, not simply throwing every possible opening wide open and hoping for the best. Keep the entrance at its normal, appropriately sized reduction for the colony's strength, and let that back-tilted outer cover do the heavy lifting on heat release instead. Site selection matters just as much as anything you do to the box itself, and it's worth getting right before a heat wave forces the issue rather than after. Old-timers generally favored orienting a hive's entrance toward the east or southeast, so the colony catches early morning sun to warm up and get foraging started promptly, while naturally getting some relief from the harshest late afternoon sun as the day wears on and the entrance side falls into shadow. Elevating the hive 6 to 18 inches off the ground on a stand does double duty here too. It improves airflow underneath the box, which helps with both moisture and heat, and it keeps the bottom board away from ground-level humidity and standing water after a storm, which matters even more in the humid climates we just talked about. And if your yard genuinely has no natural afternoon shade at all, even a strategically placed shade cloth, a market umbrella, or a few fast-growing shrubs planted specifically to block the western sun by midsummer can make a measurable difference by the time the hottest weeks of the year arrive. The kind of decision that pays off precisely because it was made in spring, long before anyone was thinking about heat. There's one more sighting detail worth checking while you're already out there with a shim in hand: prevailing wind direction. A hive positioned so that a gentle, consistent summer breeze can pass across the front entrance and up along the body of the box adds a small but genuinely free layer of cooling on top of everything else. Essentially a form of passive cross-ventilation, working alongside your top vent gap rather than instead of it. Hives tucked tightly against a solid fence or wall on their downwind side, with no airflow able to move past them at all, lose out on this entirely. And it's worth a quick walk around your apiary on a breezy day just to notice whether air is actually moving past your hives or getting blocked before it ever reaches them. There's a second layer to this old-timer approach that pairs naturally with the tilted cover, and it's just as low cost. If your hive sits in full, unbroken afternoon sun with no relief at all, even a simple piece of plywood or a shade cloth propped up on the western side of the hive, angled to block that harsh late afternoon sun specifically, can drop the box's surface temperature noticeably compared to a hive baking in direct light from noon straight through to sunset. You don't need a permanently shaded location. Full morning sun is actually good for a hive, since it helps bees get moving early and reduces the chance of certain pests that prefer cooler, damper conditions. The problem is specifically that harsh, prolonged afternoon exposure with no relief at all during the hottest hours of the day. You don't need expensive equipment to know whether any of this is actually working either, which matters because plenty of beekeepers assume monitoring hive temperature requires specialized sensors or an app. A simple outdoor thermometer with a probe, the kind sold for grilling or home brewing, can be fed through the top vent gap you've just created to give you an actual number from just above the brood nest, and it costs under $15. But if you'd rather not spend anything at all, The bees themselves are a perfectly reliable gauge if you know what to watch for. A moderate beard in the early evening that thins out and mostly clears by morning is a colony managing normal summer heat, exactly the way it's supposed to. A beard that's present all day, including the cooler morning hours, or one that keeps growing night after night without ever thinning, is telling you the colony isn't winning that battle on its own, and it's a clear signal to check your ventilation setup, your shade, and your water source before assuming anything more serious is wrong. This isn't a new problem beekeepers only started facing recently either, which is worth knowing because it's exactly why a fix this simple already existed a century ago. Commercial beekeepers moving hives by wagon and later by truck through the early 20th century, hauling colonies across hot, dusty routes to follow blooming crops, dealt with heat stress on a scale that made it impossible to ignore. A wagon full of hives with no airflow could lose comb and bees before ever reaching the next bloom. That pressure is part of why light-colored paint became such a standard practice, long before anyone had measured the science behind it precisely, and why simple, propped-lid ventilation shows up again and again in old beekeeping journals and farm manuals from that era, passed along as basic common sense rather than an advanced technique. It wasn't cutting-edge knowledge then, and it isn't now. It just quietly fell out of the instructions that ship with a modern beginner's hive kit, which tends to focus on getting a new colony established rather than on the specific challenges of a heat wave 3 months down the road. And here's the payoff piece that ties this whole thing together, the detail that actually resolves why bearding happens the way it does and what it's really telling you. Once you've got that top vent gap in place and some afternoon shade if your hive needs it, watch what happens to the bearding pattern over the following few days. A colony that's still bearding heavily, even with proper top ventilation and shade in place, is telling you something beyond simple heat stress. It may be genuinely overcrowded and outgrowing its current box, which is a population problem, not a ventilation problem. And it's often the real early warning sign of an impending swarm that beekeepers mistake for a simple heat response. Getting the ventilation right first matters because it lets you actually read that signal clearly, instead of it being muddied by a hive that's simply cooking in the sun, regardless of how strong or crowded it actually is. It's worth putting an actual number on what's at stake here, because your comb might sag doesn't quite capture the real cost of letting this go unmanaged. A single deep frame, fully drawn and capped, can hold somewhere around 6 to 8 pounds of honey once it's completely full. Lose 2 or 3 frames to a collapse, a genuinely realistic outcome from one bad, unmanaged heat event on a heavily loaded hive, and you're looking at 15 to 20 pounds of honey gone, along with the wax and the comb structure itself, which the colony then has to spend energy and resources rebuilding from scratch, rather than putting toward more honey production or brood rearing for the rest of the season. Priced at even $6 a pound retail, that's close to $100 in lost product from a single frame collapse, on top of the lost bees and brood that don't show up on any price tag at all. A 10-minute fix that costs nothing starts to look considerably more urgent once you frame it against that kind of loss. Let's lock in the big takeaways. First, bearding isn't a crisis on its own. It's the colony's own release valve for heat, and it's actually a sign the bees are managing the problem the only way they can. Second, the modern hive box, especially painted dark and sitting in full afternoon sun with a sealed top, quietly works against natural heat release, and that's a design tendency, not something you did wrong as a beekeeper. Third, a simple shim under the back of the outer cover, creating a protected top vent gap, is the exact fix old-time beekeepers relied on for generations. It costs nothing, and it takes about 10 minutes per hive to set up. And fourth, don't stop at the vent alone. Pairing it with a reliable nearby water source and a bit of afternoon shade addresses the whole cooling system the colony actually relies on, not just one piece of it. Tell me in the comments, have you ever pulled a frame after a heat wave and found sagging or collapsed comb? I want to know how common this actually is out in real backyard apiaries versus how much it just gets quietly chalked up to a rough summer without anyone tracing it back to airflow. If this helped you rethink how your hive handles heat, the next video walks through exactly how to read a bearding pattern once your ventilation is properly dialed in. Specifically how to tell the difference between simple heat stress and the early population buildup that actually precedes a swarm. Subscribe if you want it the moment it's up, and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. At the end of the day, so much of what looks like a mystery in beekeeping is really just physics and airflow, quietly working for or against you depending on a handful of small decisions most of us never think twice about. The old-timers who kept bees before insulated boxes and mail-order equipment weren't smarter than us. They just had to pay closer attention to the things a hive is actually telling them. And there's something worth holding on to in that, long after the 10-minute fix has already done its job. If you're running more than one hive, here's one last practical note before you go check on yours. Do this shim trick across every box in the same short session, rather than spreading it out over several days, since a heat wave doesn't wait for you to get around to your least favorite hive last. The colonies you check third or fourth are sitting under the exact same sun as the ones you check first. Walk the row once, a shim and a scrap of wood in hand, and you can genuinely have 5 or 6 hives properly vented in under an hour, which is a small enough time investment that there's really no good excuse to put it off until after this year's first serious heat wave has already done its damage. Check back in on that gap a day or two after you set it, just to confirm the shim hasn't shifted and the cover is still sitting securely enough to shed rain. That's the entire follow-up required. No ongoing maintenance, no seasonal adjustment schedule. Just one quick confirmation that a 10-minute fix is still doing exactly what it was built to do.